There's a concept called Nesirut Nefesh, which means when an individual is prepared, willing, and sometimes in action, gives up everything. Ultimately, a person gives up their life in order to help others, in order to bring assistance to others. One example that most of us know is Rabbi Akiva, the teacher of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. 2,000 years ago, the Romans who ruled the land of Israel decreed that nobody is allowed to teach. Many people stopped teaching. In those days, there weren't sort of set up academies of learning, but there would be a teacher, Rabbi Akiva being one of the leading teachers at the time, and groups of students would gather around them. Most of the teachers at the time, after hearing the Roman decree was, if you continue to teach, we will put you to death. Most of the teachers stopped teaching. Rabbi Akiva continued to teach. He taught Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he taught really the people who would be the leaders of the next generation. And as we know, eventually Rabbi Akiva was caught and he was put to death by the Romans. The Kabbalists teach the reason why, again, Rabbi Akiva was able to bring down into this world the great light that he did was because he was willing, as he did, give up of himself completely. That is the action of Pinchas. It is really the first time that an individual was willing to die, as Pinchas most likely believed was going to happen, in order to bring an end to the plague, to the death that was occurring at that time in the desert. And that's really the secret, again, of this Shabbat, because the Kabbalists teach that if a person, and to the degree that a person is willing to act with what we call Nesirut Nefesh, giving up of him or herself, to that degree the gates of miracles, the gates of healing, ultimately, as we see with Pinchas, even the gates of immortality become opened. And that's why it's important to understand, when we talk about Nesirut Nefesh, or giving up of oneself, it's not expected of most of us to be on the level of Rabbi Akiva, most of us to be on the level of Pinchas. But it does mean that if we want to truly partake of the great light that is available, we have to ask ourselves on a consistent basis, what do I give up of myself in order to assist, in order to share, in order to bring goodness, to bring light to others? Very often it's easy to be a spiritual person who makes their connections and their prayers and follows a spiritual practice, but does not necessarily focus on this concept of Nesirut Nefesh. But what the Kabbalists teach is that for the gates to open, and especially gates that are not naturally opened, there has to be a willingness to give up of oneself. And again, not that we're expected to be on that ultimate level, but giving up of yourself means to do what you don't want to do what's uncomfortable for you to do. All of us have maybe a continuum of things. On one extent, one side of it are the things that we enjoy doing, even spiritual actions. Some people like to meditate, some people like to pray, some people like to study, some people like to share. And that's positive, but that's not really the type of action that can open up gates. The type of action that can open up gates is to some degree of Nesirut Nefesh, some degree of an individual doing an action that he or she does not want to do, that he or she finds uncomfortable to do. Those type of actions, which are called Nesirut Nefesh, are the ones that open up the gates. That's what the secret of Pinchas is. We call it the Shabbat of healing, but really what Pinchas accomplished, as the Zohar tells us, he actually accomplished immortality. Pinchas, as the Zohar says, became Eliyahu Navi, Elijah the prophet, who is alive till this day. So we call it the Shabbat of healing, maybe because it's easier for us to understand, but it's really the Shabbat when really all the gates can be opened. But you have to, in order to receive a certain blessing, you have to have, as the Kabbalists call it, a shivui tzura, a similarity of form with that blessing. So what is the similarity of form that is like Pinchas, that is like Rabbi Akiva? Nesirut Nefesh. So really, as we think, as we study even about the unique light that is available, in order to truly be able to receive it, in order to truly be able to continuously draw it into our lives, we have to be thinking, what are the consistent actions that I am willing, that I am going to accept to do, that are not comfortable for me to do, that I don't want to do? Those are the Nesirut Nefesh. Those are the actions that truly open up the gates. And that's what the Shabbat is about. Nesirut Nefesh, giving up of ourselves. Pinchas opened up that channel for us. But in order for us to partake of it, we have to be willing to give up of ourselves as well. By giving up of ourselves, we merit the opening up of the gates. And that's why the Zohar in this week's portion begins. Beginda, the Zohar says, and as the Rav said here, it's important that we remind ourselves every time we read from the Zohar, it's not simply new understanding or new wisdom, but it actually opens up gates. The power of the Zohar is that it's not just wisdom or understanding, but it actually opens up gates for us. And the Zohar says, so as we read these words, it's not just that we want to understand them, we want to use them as a way to awaken this light for us. And important to mention, it's now after midnight. The Kabbalists teach that there's no more powerful time in the day than after midnight to draw blessings, to draw miracles, to draw light, because that's the time that the light of the Creator is more plentiful, is more open, is more accessible. And that's why the Zohar says it's important for a person who truly wants to be connected to the light of the Creator, to at least once a week to be able to wake up after midnight and make a connection and study in prayer. And there's no other time of the week, than Friday night, Shabbat, that this light is actually even more revealed. So the most powerful, really, if you can understand, the most powerful time to connect to study is after midnight on Friday night. So it's not a coincidence we're all gathered here. There's, again, the gates are truly opened. And now as we read from the Zohar, we actually have the ability to connect to it. But it's a very auspicious time to be studying together. So the Zohar says, the Cholman, the Ishtadel Beoraita Behai Alma. Whoever studies this wisdom, but more importantly, the Zohar, the word in Aramaic, Ishtadel, doesn't just simply mean to study, but toils, does the work to not just study, to understand, to use this wisdom to change, uses this wisdom to bring light to others. But Cholman di Ishtadel Beoraita Behai Alma. Whoever pushes him or herself to study this wisdom in this world, Zachi diftechun le kamatarin. He merits that the supernal gates open up for him or her. Kama nehorim. How many lights, an endless amount of lights that shine down on him. Ve'azla lechol neturi tarin. When we study, we awaken light, the Zohar says, that then becomes almost like a key that opens up the supernal gates. The study that we do as we're doing now becomes light that goes with us, and when we need a gate to be opened, that light goes and opens the gate to us. The Zohar says that in front of every blessing that we want, especially those that are more difficult, if it's a gift of healing that we're trying to awaken that's maybe more than the usual, but any other type of miracle, any other type of blessing that's more than the usual, there's what's called a neturi tarin. There's an angel or an energy that's there to protect that gate, that does not allow that gate to be opened. What you need is some other energy, some other light to be the key to open up that gate, to go past the keepers of that gate, as the Zohar calls it. So this light, the Zohar says, and this really should be our thought tonight as we're studying this, we're awakening light, and this light, Azla lechol neturi tarin, goes to all the keepers of the gates, all that energy that is there. Its purpose is to make it more difficult for us to access that healing, to access whatever miracle, to access whatever blessing that we desire, that we need. The light that we're awakening now through the study goes to those keepers of the gates. Machrezet ve'omeret, and it announces and says, Pitchu she'arim, open up the gates. So the study and the light that we reveal through the study becomes the force, the light, the energy that goes to all the keepers of the gates and says, Pitchu she'arim, open up the gates. And the reason why the Zohar says that this study, especially after midnight, especially of the secrets of the Zohar, is so powerful, because there is nothing, the Zohar says, that gives the light of the Creator more joy as one who studies this wisdom, who studies the Torah, who studies these secrets. Kol sheken, the Zohar says, and this is true for anybody who studies, who makes a connection to this wisdom. But it's even more so, the Zohar says, even more powerful. Barnash demitar belelia, when a person is up in the middle of the night, l'ishtadya beoraita, and studies and toils. So if for those of us who are maybe more tired, we're going to connect to more light than those of us who are less tired. For those of us who it's more difficult to be studying now, we receive more light than those of us for whom it is easier. The Zohar says, when a person is up after midnight and studies, there's nothing that brings greater joy to the Creator, and therefore there is nothing that draws greater light to the individual. The Zohar says, all the righteous souls who have left this world, who are in this upper supernal world, they listen to the voice of the individual who wakes up after midnight to study. So now as we're sitting here and studying together after midnight, all the righteous souls from the upper worlds are listening to our words. And what happens when they listen to our words, they connect to us. And then what we need, if it's healing, if it's any other type of miracle, they assist us in opening up the gate so that light can come to us. The begin to the end, the Zohar says, all the righteous souls that are in what's called the Garden of Eden, their place was called the Tzor HaNeshamot, the place where all the righteous souls reside. Tzaitin lekole, they listen to our voice as we study. Vekudsha berichu mishtakach beinayu, and the light of the Creator is amongst those righteous souls who are listening to us and to anybody who wakes up after midnight to study. As it says, Hayoshevet baganim chaverim makshivim lekolech hashmi'i. If you wake up after midnight, the righteous souls listen to your voice, and the light of the Creator that resides amongst the righteous souls listen to you as well. Amar Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, Kol inun, all those, dezakan le'shtadla be'oraita, that have the merit to understand the importance of this study, and understand the importance of waking up after midnight and studying. Umikad palig leilia, after midnight. Ve'atyan bematronita kadnai yemama. What happens is that you receive the light of what's called a chut shel chesed, a light of protection from the Creator for the whole rest of the day. El deshaya bechut shel chesed kimadu kimna. All those who wake up after midnight receive protection throughout their whole rest of the day, which again is important to understand, that if ever we're in need the next day of protection, if we're ever in need of an extra infusion of light the next day, by waking up after midnight, as Rabbi Shimon tells us, we not only, of course, receive the power to open up gates, as the Zohar said earlier, but also we receive this concept, the Zohar calls it a chut shel chesed, an overwhelming opening of the channel of right column of mercy that protects and envelops the individual who has woken up after midnight to study. So, not a coincidence that this week's Zohar in the beginning speaks about the importance of what we're doing right now. And the more, as the Rav always says, consciousness is everything. We have to know what we're doing. We have to know the power of what we're doing. We're gathered here together, and we know, as the Zohar says, that the more people who are making the connection, the more easier it is for them. Meaning, if we were sitting at our home alone studying, certainly we would be connecting to a certain amount of light. But the fact that we're here gathered as a larger group, it makes it much easier for all of us to awaken that light. Again, as the Zohar says, first, that we receive the light to be able to open up the gates. Those things that maybe up until now were difficult for us, those miracles or those blessings that were more difficult for us to access, now we awaken the light to open up those gates. And second, we also draw upon ourselves this protective light, what's called the chut shel chesed, this protective light of mercy that will envelop us at least for the next 24 hours. And now I'd like to read a section from the Zohar that speaks of the ability to remove judgment. What is illness? Illness is judgment. Any type of negativity, and it's important. It's good as we read the section now to think if it's of ourselves or people that we know that need healing, because the gift of the Shabbat, and that's where we're going to read the section in the Zohar, is to give us that ability to remove judgment. Because illness, of course, is judgment. Judgment beginning to manifest, chas v'shalom, and what we want to do is not allow it to ever manifest completely, and more importantly, to remove that judgment completely. And this story, teaching from the Zohar, awakens for us, by reading it, the ability to remove this judgment. Rabbi Yitzchak, who was one of the students of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Havayativ Yom Achad Apitcha de Rabbi Yehuda. One day, he stood by the doorway, by the house of one of the other friends, one of the other students, Rabbi Yehuda. V'hava atziv. And as he was sitting there at the door, he was sad. Nafik Rabbi Yehuda, so his friend Rabbi Yehuda walked out the door, and he saw that his friend Rabbi Yitzchak was sitting there and that he was sad. And he saw that his friend was sitting there and he was sad. Amar lei, so Rabbi Yehuda says to his friend Rabbi Yitzchak, Man yomadein nishar yomin. He says, why are you sad? We know, as we shared a few weeks ago, where Bradway told the Rav, one of the gifts of the true Kabbalists, they understand that in order for the light of the Creator to be connected to us, we have to be like the light of the Creator. And when a person is full of joy, when a person is happy, that draws more of the light of the Creator to him. When a person is sad, he's disconnected from the light of the Creator. He almost does not allow the light of the Creator to be bestowed, to fall upon him. The students of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai were always happy. So when Rabbi Yehuda walks out of his house and he sees his good friend Rabbi Yitzchak sitting there and sad, he says to him, what happened? Something must have happened, because we know and we learn from our teacher Rabbi Shimon to always be happy. Why are you sad? Amar lei, so Rabbi Yitzchak says to his good friend Rabbi Yehuda, Atina legabach, I've come to you, mibai minach tlat milin. I've come here today, he says to his friend Rabbi Yehuda, I've come here to ask from you 3 favors. Chad, the first favor, the chad tema midlei deoraita. In the future, he says, when you're going to repeat words, wisdom, teachings that I originated, that I said, the tema lon mishmi, make sure you mention my name. Don't just say, if you've heard wisdom from me, he says, don't just say them, make sure you say, my friend Rabbi Yitzchak taught this. Say my name when you say over this teaching. Begin la'ad karashmi, because I want to make sure that clearly he's indicating that for whatever reason he believes he's going to die, he's going to leave this world, and he wants to make sure, Rabbi Yitzchak does, that his name is repeated even after he leaves this world. So that's the first request. The first request Rabbi Yitzchak has of Rabbi Yehuda is that even after I leave this world, he says, when you repeat words of wisdom that I have taught, that you mention my name when you repeat them. V'chad, the second request that I have, the tizke le Yosef beri beoraita. He says, I have a young son. His name is Joseph. Please do me a favor. Rabbi Yitzchak says to Rabbi Yehuda, teach him the Torah, teach him the wisdom, because I'm not going to be here to teach it to him. So please make sure you teach my son. The chad, and the third request Rabbi Yitzchak has of his friend Rabbi Yehuda, the teze lekivri kol zayin yomin. For the 7 days after I pass away, he says, go to my grave every day of the 7 days. Betibai be'uta chalai. And if you have a request, if you need assistance from the light of the Creator, come to my grave and ask for it, and I'll assist you. So clearly, these 3 requests that Rabbi Yitzchak is requesting of Rabbi Yehuda have to do with the fact that he sees that he's about to leave this world, and therefore he asks that his name is mentioned whenever words of wisdom are repeated that he taught. He asks that Rabbi Yehuda teach his son, Rabbi Yosef, and he asks that for the 7 days after he passes away, that Rabbi Yehuda goes to his grave and pray there. Amalei minayin lach. So Rabbi Yehuda says to Rabbi Yitzchak, how do you know that you're going to die? How do you know that you're leaving this world? He says, Amalei hanishmati estalket mini becholelia, velo anhir li bechelma. The Kabbalists were very much in touch with their soul, and they knew what happens with their soul even while they were asleep. And he says, when I go to sleep, there's a certain process that my soul goes through, has gone through my entire life. But now I see that it's slowly detaching itself from my body. My experience with my soul is different. And when I go to sleep, I feel that it's the process of reconnection in the morning with my body is not as it was. And this is an indication to me, Rabbi Yitzchak says, that my soul is detaching itself from the body. We know, as the Kabbalists teach, that 30 days before a person passes away, the soul actually begins a process of slowly detaching itself from the body. That's one indication. Rabbi Yehuda asked him, how do you know that you're going to leave this world? He says his first indication was the fact that he feels his soul detaching itself from his body. A second indication that I have, Rabbi Yitzchak says, that I'm going to leave this world. That when I pray, umatina l'shomei tefillah, and there's a certain section in the prayer, it's called the blessing of shomei tefillah, he who hears the prayers. Ashkechana b'tzulmi dili b'chotla. Kabbalists teach that a person's shadow, and not just the shadow as we know it, but there's an important way to know the attachment of the person's shadow and his soul. And again, 30 days before a person leaves this world, something happens to that level of what's called a tselem, or that's indicated in the shadow. He says, when I come to this section of prayer and I look at my shadow, I see that it's missing that part, that is the spiritual connective aspect between the soul and the body. He says, and because of this, I know that it means that I have about 30 days before my soul leaves my body. He says, so Rabbi Yehuda says to Rabbi Yitzchak, I understand what you're saying, and I agree, I will promise you that I will do these three things that you ask of me. Aval be'ina minach, and now Rabbi Yehuda says, I ask of you a favor as well. Deve'ahu alma, that in that world, tevarir duchta gabach, make sure that in that world you prepare a place for me. Rabbi Yitzchak says he's going to leave this world. He's asking Rabbi Yehuda to give him those three favors. Rabbi Yehuda says, I'll do these three favors for you, but do me a favor that prepare a place for me. So whenever my time comes to leave this world, I will be next to you. Bacha Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak began to cry. Ve'amar, and he says to his friend Rabbi Yehuda, B'matu minach, I beg of you, I ask of you, D'lo titparesh minai kol ilin yomin. Don't leave me for all these next days. Meaning from now until I leave this world, I ask you, Rabbi Yitzchak says to his friend Rabbi Yehuda, don't leave me. Azul legabei de Rabbi Shimon. What do you do when you have a problem? What do you do when you have a difficulty? They go to visit their teacher, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Ashkechu dahavalai be'oraita. And as they meet Rabbi Shimon, he was sitting and he was studying. Zakif einoi Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon looked up at his two students, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yitzchak. V'chamel Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Shimon saw his student, Rabbi Yitzchak. V'chamel lemalach hamavet derahit kamei. And he saw that the angel of death was dancing in front of Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was able to see that there is this judgment of death on his student, Rabbi Yitzchak. Kam Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Shimon stood up. Achid biyadei de Rabbi Yitzchak. He held on to the hand of his student, Rabbi Yitzchak. Amar, and he said, Gozarna, I decree, Man deragel lemei al ye'ol, whoever usually enters my house, I give them permission to enter now. Uman de lo ragil lemei al lo ye'ol, and whoever does not usually enter my house, referring to the angel of death, referring to the energy of judgment and death, I do not give them permission to enter into my house. And we know that even the angel of death, but no force of judgment was able to be around Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai sees that there is this terrible judgment prepared to come onto his student, Rabbi Yitzchak, and he says, for now, I decree that Rabbi Yitzchak and my other student, Rabbi Yehuda, can enter my house, but all those forces of judgment, of death, that do not usually enter my house, do not have permission. I do not give them permission to enter. And again, as we read these words, we should be thinking about those people who need healing, those people who need assistance, through the light, the study of the light of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Ha'alu Rabbi Yitzchak v'Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yitzchak and Rabbi Yehuda entered into the house, and the Zohar says, Katir malach hamavet levar. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was able to tie up the angel of death, to leave outside that judgment, to leave outside that force of death. And that's, again, what we want to draw for ourselves, for others, for the world on this Shabbat, the power, the ability to leave that judgment outside, to leave that force of illness, of death outside. Ashkach Rabbi Shimon was able to tell, V'chama de'ad ka'an lomata idna. It was the day upon which Rabbi Yitzchak was decreed to leave this world, but he still had a few more hours in this world. And And he saw that that his time had not come. He had another 8 hours to live. So what do you do if you have another 8 hours in this world? Rabbi Shimon says to Rabbi Yitzchak, you have another 8 hours in this world, let's study together. Amar Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Elazar Berei, I have about 30 days. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai wanted to make sure that the force of death does not enter too soon. So he says to his son Rabbi Elazar, he says, Tiva Pitcha, sit by the door. Says to Rabbi Yitzchak, no matter who comes, I promise you, don't speak to anybody. I will do these three things that you ask of me. And use everything that you know, any force that you need to use, any prayer, any invocation that you need to do. Don't allow anybody or anything to enter our house. Amar Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Shimon then asks the student Rabbi Yitzchak, Chamet yokna de'avuch yomada olo. Have you seen the image of your father? Rabbi Yitzchak's father had already passed into the next world. Rabbi Shimon, we know that before a person leaves this world, his relatives who have left this world come to assist the soul in its process of going to that next world. So Rabbi Shimon asks Rabbi Yitzchak, have you seen the face of your father or not? So he says, as Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai repeats to him, we learned b'shata de balnash estalek me'alma. When a person's time comes to leave this world, avoy v'krivoi mishtakhin tamanime. His father and his close relatives come to assist him. V'chamalon v'ishto modalon, and he sees them. V'chol inun dehava medore gabayu ba'u alma, and not just his relatives, but also all those with whom his place will be in that world. Kulu mitkanshi u'mishtakhi imei. They all gather to support him and assist him. Ve'azlin in nishmate, and they go with the individual soul who has left this world, adatar de tishrei b'atrei, until its place in that world. So Rabbi Shimon asked his student Rabbi Yitzchak, have you seen the face of your father? Amar, he said, ad ka'an lo chamena. I have not seen him yet. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai sees there's an opening here. Ad hachi Kam Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Shimon gets up, and when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai stood up, it was an indication of trying to accomplish something, trying to do something. Ve'amar, and he says, Marei da'alma. He now speaks to the Creator, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He says to the Creator, Ishtamoda Rabbi Yitzchak legaban. He says to the Creator, Rabbi Yitzchak is one of ours. He's one of my students. He's one of my close students. We know that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai had 10 students, 3 of whom departed this world and was called the Idra Rabbah, after the great revelation was called the Idra Rabbah. And after those 3 passed away, there were only 7 students, with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son Rabbi Elazar, 5 other students. So Rabbi Shimon says to the Creator, Mi'inun shiva einen dehachahu. He says, one of my group of 7 students. Ha'achid nabei v'havli. I hold on to him, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says. Give him to me. Meaning, don't let him die, don't let the angel of death take him. Nafa kala ve'amar, a voice in the heavens came out and said, Hadidachu, if you want him, he's yours. Ve'imach teitei. But when you leave this world, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, when you decide to leave this world, you have to bring him with you. He's now yours, and he will live as long as you want him to live. And when you leave this world, as on Lag BaOmer, you have to bring him with you. Amar Rabbi Shimon Vadai. Rabbi Shimon says, I promise. He will be with me, and when my time to leave, when I decide to leave this world, I will bring him with me. Adahachi Chama Rabbi Elazar. All this time, Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, was sitting outside. And in this moment, he sees the Ha'istalek Malach HaMavet, the angel of death, that force that brings death, that force that brings an end, that force that brings illness, disappeared. Ve'amar, and he said, Leit kuftera de tifsa be'atar de Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai shechiach. And when Rabbi Elazar saw this, he said, there can be no judgment. There can be no judgment in the place where Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai resides. And this really is the story. Is a very interesting story. Of those of you who haven't studied this, I strongly recommend it. It's in the section of Vayechi from section 152 on. But the most important part of the story, and the light that we are awakening for ourselves, for the Rav, for those around us, for those who we think of who need healing, is that we are awakening through this study, through this light. Leit kufsara de tifscha, there can be no force of judgment where the light of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai resides. And by attaching ourselves, by connecting ourselves to this light on this evening, we are given the ability, through the actions of Pinchas, through the light of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, to truly and completely remove those forces of judgment from ourselves. As we said, to make sure we manifest it, because that light is available. You know, one of the things that Rav Ashlag teaches is that the light of the Creator reveals a lot more light than we receive, right? Depending on our vessel, depending on what we allow to manifest and hold on to, that's how much light will retained by us, will remain with us. But that light is available, and we're, as the connection through the study that we're making, through our desire, we are awakening this gift. And again, these words, because these words have the power to awaken it. Leit kuftera de tifsa be'atad Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai shliach. There can be no force of judgment, no force of illness, no force of death, where this light of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai is revealed. So we all ask for the merit to truly awaken this light, to remove any judgment. You know, the Kabbalists teach that that force of judgment can be removed in two ways. One is once it's manifest, when you become aware of it, and it's possible to remove it, but more difficult. The other time to remove the judgment is before it's manifest. Because everything that occurs in our world begins as a force in the supernal world, both the blessings that come down or chas v'shalom, judgments that come down. But if you're able to awaken the light to remove that judgment before it's become manifest, it's much easier to do. So certainly for those who we know need healing, for those who we know need this force of removal of judgment, we ask for it tonight. But even for those of us who aren't aware of judgment that we need to remove, we ask that tonight, if it's there in the supernal world, all forces of judgment should be removed through the light that we are connecting to by our desire to awaken this for us and for those around us. Shabbat Shalom.